Hello everyone and welcome back to .NET Core Central, the channel where I discussed about different features of .NET Core and related technologies. Today I'm going to take a deep dive into default interface methods, which was introduced with C# 8 and .NET Core 3.0. Couple of weeks back I discussed about my top 5 features which was released as a part of C# 8, and default interface method was definitely one of them. But at that point in time, I was not too sure about how useful this feature is going to be. So today I'm going to take you through my experiences dealing with it so far. So the things which I'm going to cover is what is default interface method, how to implement them, one of the side effects of default interface methods and how .NET Core or C# 8 handles it, and last but not the least, why I think we don't need this feature. So let's start with one by one. So what is default interface methods? Default interface method is a method that is implemented inside of an interface. So this is just not a declaration. This is a full-fledged implementation of a method or of a member. It doesn't have to be just a method. It can be a method, it can be a property, or it can be an event, but it is essentially a full-fledged implementation of that member. Default interface methods can be public, internal, protected, or private. They can be virtual as well, so that deriving interface can override them. So they can pretty much have all the characteristics of a method which is implemented in a class. But the only difference I would say is when we declare a method inside of an interface, we cannot have instance member, which is obvious because we will never create an object out of an interface. So what is allowed is static members, meaning that we can declare a static field which we can use inside of the function. When I go through the example, it will become more clear. So let's start with an example. So first I'm going to create a new project in .NET Core. I'm going to just create a console application and I'm going to name it as okay. Once the project is created, I'm going to create interface and I'm going to name it as I default method interface. So inside of this interface, I'm going to have property string, and then I'm going to create a public default interface method. So for the default interface method, let's say I'm going to create a function which will print name, right? So it will be we can see that we can have a public function inside of an interface with an implementation. So that's essentially in a nutshell what default interface method is. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to also show what are the different things or different variations we can have inside an interface. So as I mentioned earlier, we can have static members. So I can create a So I can have a private static member called greetings, and then I can have another function I can call it name with greetings, and this one is going to return so it's going to return the greetings with name, and here I can print the output of this function. So as you can see, I can have a standard interface method which we usually declare. I can have a static member. I can have a private member or private function. And then I can have the public function which will be used outside. So now I can go and have an implementation for this interface. So I can name it as this is of course a terrible name, but for showing the feature of default interface method, I think this is okay. So now I have an implementation for default interface. So I have a name which I'm setting as a part of the default interface method name. I can just get rid of these and make it public. It's the same thing. So I have this now. Now what I'm going to do is a couple of things I'm going to show. Once I go to the main method, now inside of the main method, I'm going to create the instance of the default method interface implementation class. So I'll name it as implementation equal to new of default method interface implementation class. And then now you can see here, once I do implementation dot, I can see the name property which is defined as a part of the interface, but I don't see the print name. It's because print name is actually a member of the interface and not default method interface implementation class. Meaning that here if I do, I'll get the red squiggly, and if I want to do a compilation, it will give me a compile error also saying that this method does not exist, right? Yeah. You can see that we get a compile error. But if I change, instead of var, which is just inferring to this type only, instead of that, if I do a I default method interface, you'll see that the red squiggly is gone, and now it recognizes print name, because print name is defined inside of the I default interface, which means whatever we declare, the reference type has to be the interface for it to be able to access a default method implementation, unless we go and override these inside of this class. So now if I change it to var, this is going to work because I have overridden. And now if I run this application, I'll see that the overridden method, the output of the overridden method will be shown. You can see that, right? So let me go back and change the implementation. Let me get rid of this. And here also make it as and it says hello because I have never passed a name property. So let me pass the name or set the name property here. So if I set the name property to my name and run this application, we can see it is printing my name as expected. Okay, so this is very basic implementation of default interface method. Now question is, why or when would we need it? Now this is not a new concept. This comes from concept called traits, which is available in object-oriented programming language. I think PHP has this, and also functional programming language like Scala have traits. So this has been around for quite some time. C# has just implemented it. I think Java also has a concept of traits. Now the problem with this is it kinds of creates the issue of multiple inheritance, which is present in C++. Now to demonstrate that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another class or another interface, and I'm going to name it as I instrument. So let's say it's a financial instrument, and it has a method called buy. For simplicity, I'll keep it like empty. Now I have another interface called stock, which derives from the instrument, and here I can do so I can provide an implementation for buy. So at this point, the buy becomes a default method for stock or default interface method for stock, but it is overriding the buy of I instrument. Now if I have another interface, bond, which also derives from I instrument, and here also what I do is I override the buy and provide a default implementation for buy. Okay, so now if I do that, let's consider we have an implementation. So if I do that, we're all good, right? Now let's change the implementation a little bit. Let's say it implements the, let me change the name of these interfaces. It should be iStock, should be iBond. So now let's say this implements iStock as well as iBond because it has to buy both. Once I do that, I can see I'm getting an error here, and it says the interface member instrument.buy does not have a more specific implementation. Neither iStock nor iBond are more specific. It's essentially because both of them have a default implementation, we're getting into the multiple inheritance issue that is available in C++, and the way C# compiler is handling with it is through this compile time error. Now we cannot build this. If we build this, we'll get the compile time error. So this is the way C# restricts multiple inheritance when it comes to default interface methods implementation. So now the third point I wanted to discuss is why I think this feature is not needed. Well, in my opinion, if we have to go and change an interface after it goes to production, during design time we have not thought through. So it promotes a lazy design. It's basically, let's go with what we have, and in future if we do want to implement anything, we'll just throw in a default interface method and we should be good. We are not going to break any other classes. To me, that's just a lazy design. The other point is, if I have to have an implementation like this, or where all of the classes which derive from the interface does not need that method, then this method definitely doesn't belong to this interface. It belongs to someone else. It belongs to some other interface if one specific class is going to use that method. In that case, I'm going to have a different interface class combination, and I'm going to use that to provide that feature instead of creating a default interface method. That's a much cleaner solution. I personally don't see myself using default interface method. Now what I would suggest is, if we have to use, then there has to be a very compelling reason, and it has to be during design time. If during design time we don't see a need for a default interface method, then I would say I would never use it post design is complete. Now in light of that, if we have to, let me first delete this so that my class can build. Okay, now in light of that, if I have to, so let's say this default interface method, for like example's sake, this default interface method already had name, and it is implemented by this class, and it is all happy. Now there is another class who comes in who needs name, and he also needs print name. In that case, I am not going to create a default interface method, because not all of my class need that function. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go ahead and create another interface, and I'm going to call it as like name printer, and I'm going to define a print name inside of that interface, and then I'm going to have a class, let's call it iNamePrinter. Today for some reason I'm missing I for every interface, so I can have a class called namePrinter which implements iNamePrinter, and then I'm going to have, I can have the same implementation here, and here in the constructor I can have so in the constructor I can expect the iDefault interface, and then I'm just composing this, and the caller of the class which needs the name as well as print name, they can implement iNamePrinter, which is the name printer in my case here, and they can inject the default interface, right? So this is one implementation where the name printer itself can implement iNamePrinter, and we can take the default interface as, you know, constructor injected parameter, and then use that to print name. But let's say this is not what we want. We want to have both the name as well as print name as a part of this class, in which case what we are going to do is it's going to change the implementation like this. We're going to get rid of this one, and we are going to implement the interface here, and we'll have a, let's get rid of this and this, and we'll have a private string name, and here we're just going to return the name, and here we're going to set the name to the value, right? So then this will be the implementation. We're just going to have two interfaces implemented by namePrinter, and which does what it is supposed to do. And if we go back to program, the print name is no longer available to default implementation, because that's what we wanted to do in the first place. We did not want the default method interface implementation to have print name. We wanted the name printer to have print name. So that way we segregate the interface into two and we achieve the same functionality. So that's just my take. I personally feel like the default interface method is not a very good idea. I think it will promote a lot of bad design or lazy designs. I would go with more solid principles based design, in which case I'll keep single responsibility principle and interface segregation for better design, and probably never use the default interface method. There might be some cases, but as of now I don't see any. I'd really like to hear from you what you think about this feature and what are the practical cases where you can see this is going to be really helpful. Thank you so much for watching this video so far. If you have not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up.